Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. The small town of Chesterville, Alabama, seemed frowned in time. Wooden houses with peeling paint, a police station with a cracked sign, and a central square with a Confederate monument were all reminders of a past that never left this town. Tourists rarely came here, and the locals prided themselves on their authenticity. Chesterville was a town where the words, "That's the way it's always been," sounded like an excuse for everything. Here, white farmers lived in spacious houses, while the African American community, made up mostly of descendants of former slaves, lived in ramshackle houses on the outskirts. Most blacks worked for white families on their farms, in their homes, or in the town's only laundry. No one in Chesterville was in any hurry to change. The town lived in the past. Old laws and prejudices were deeply embedded in its foundations. The white elite, a few farm families and a local magistrate, determined the order, while the rest of us kept our heads down. Racism in Chesterville was not something hidden. It was everywhere, from small gestures of contempt to open humiliation. A police sheriff, looking at an elderly black woman with a chuckle, could say, "See you around, Miss Louise. I hope you don't do anything out there on the street." His words always sounded like a threat, though Mrs. Louise was known for her good-naturedness. A Southside supermarket stood on the main street. Its owner, Mr. Hanks, a white-skinned man in his 50s, openly expressed his contempt for black customers. "They're always stealing something from me," he told friends, though no one had ever confirmed a single instance of theft. It was not easy for a black man to live in this city. Every step was like walking on thin ice. Any wrong look or word could be disastrous. But Mrs. Louise learned to live in this world. Her life was an example of resilience, but even she knew that Chesterville was not a safe place to live. The story of Chesterville is a story of struggle and silence, where one side still clung to its false superiority, and the other learned to survive by finding the strength not to break. Mrs. Louise Thompson was born in 1951 in Chesterville, in a tiny hut on the outskirts of town. Her mother worked as a laundress, and her father worked on a cotton plantation owned by the Jenkins family, the same Jenkins whose descendants still owned half the local farms. Louise grew up in a world where her place was predetermined before she was born. Even as a child, she realized that life for people like her was a constant struggle. One day, when she was only 6 years old, she went with her mother to deliver clean laundry to a farmer's house. As she entered the spacious hallway, she accidentally touched a crystal vase. It shook slightly, but did not fall. The owner of the house, a white-skinned woman with a stern look, shouted, "Get that little monkey out of my house before she destroys it." Louise will never forget how her mother, her eyes downcast, apologized, and then, on the street, holding back tears, whispered, "You should be quieter than water, lower than grass. They don't consider us human beings here." Louise's school years were short. At 14, she dropped out of school to work in the city and help her mother. Her first job was at a cafe where she was paid 5 cents an hour. The owner, the fat and sweaty Mr. Randolph, always looked at her in such a way that Louise was afraid to go into the back room alone. At the age of 18, Louisa married Henry Thompson, a construction worker. They dreamed of moving to the big city, but life had other plans. After the birth of 2 children, money was leaving faster than it was being earned. Henry was killed in an automobile accident when their youngest son was only 3 years old. From then on, Mrs. Louise was left alone. She worked as a housekeeper, scrubbing floors, doing laundry, nursing the sick. Her hands, once soft and delicate, became rough as sandpaper. Her back ached every day, But she never complained. Her children left Chesterville as they had dreamed. Her daughter became a teacher in Chicago, her son a bus driver in Atlanta. They called her every week, offering to move her in. But Louise refused. "This is my home. If I leave, who will fight for us?" Mrs. Louise became something of an unspoken leader of the local black community. She knew everyone in her neighborhood, helped those who were in trouble, and always had a kind word for those who wronged her. Her knitting became not just a hobby, but a symbol of her perseverance. Every plaid, every pair of socks was her small victory over her circumstances. At the fair, not only blacks but also whites bought her clothes, because the quality of her work exceeded all expectations. But even a woman as strong as Mrs. Louise could not completely shield herself from humiliation. Her kindness and steadfastness irritated those who did not want to see equality. Every step she took down the main street was a trial, but she held on. Louise was used to not responding to hurtful words. She knew that if she showed even a little anger, she would be labeled dangerous or rude. But deep down, her wounds would not heal. She was a woman who carried the weight of decades of injustice on her shoulders, but her heart remained filled with love. Love for people, for life, for the world. She hoped to make a little better, no matter what. That all changed one ordinary day when she walked into a Southside supermarket. The morning in Chesterville had begun with a cool breeze, but by noon the sun was so hot that the asphalt on the streets seemed red hot. Mrs. Louise walked toward the Southside supermarket, leaning habitually on her old cane. Her steps were slow but sure. She was clutching a small, shabby bag, inside of which were the discount coupons she had collected over the past 2 weeks. The Southside supermarket was the only large store in Chesterville, and Louise could not afford to ignore its stock. The owner was Mr. Hanks, known for his contemptuous attitude toward black customers. Every time she entered the store, Louise could feel Hank's gaze burning into her back. Today was no exception. Once inside, she immediately felt the contrast between the cool air of the air conditioners and the scorching heat outside. The saleswomen at the cash registers were whispering, but they were silent when they saw her. Louise paid no attention. She picked up her basket and headed for the grocery shelves. Milk, some bread, vegetables, a jar of jam too. She chose each item with care, mentally calculating to feed her budget. When everything was packed, Louise stood in line at the cash register. There were several people standing in front of her, whose conversations died down as she approached. Behind her stood Walter Jenkins, a man in his 40s with a massive body, weathered face, and rough manners. The Jenkinses had always been known for their arrogance, but Walter seemed to relish his reputation. He owned a large farm, built on the labor of a generation of blacks. "How many of these lazy people can we see here?" he muttered loud enough to be heard. Louise didn't turn around. She just stood there, looking in front of her. The line was silent, as if no one had heard anything. When it was her turn, she slowly pulled out her coupons and held them out to the cashier. The girl, very young, looked nervously at Louise and took them, but Walter couldn't hold back any longer. "Here we go. Those beggars again," he shouted. "Haven't you tried working, old girl? Or are you so used to only taking?" Mrs. Louise felt the blood rush to her face. She swallowed hard and replied quietly, "I pay for my groceries, Mr. Jenkins. So do you." Her words only made him angrier. Walter stepped closer, stood beside her, and leaned in so that his face was next to her ear. "Are you paying?" he asked. "On the handouts we white people give you. Is that what you call paying? You'd better keep quiet, grandmother, or maybe I'll decide what to do with you." There was a threat in his voice, too clear to ignore. Louise straightened, trying not to show fear. The line around her frenzy. People, both white and black, watched, but no one intervened. The cashier hurried through her purchases, eyes downcast. She knew that if she said a word in defense of Mrs. Louise, it might cost her her job. Louise, gathering her bags, took a step away from the register. She tried not to look back, but she heard Walter laughing loudly after her. "Go back to your shack, old woman. You stink of poverty in here." It was hot outside, but Louise could feel the cold chilling her to the bone. She walked, clutching her bags, not looking around. Walter's words sounded like an angry whisper in her head. Billy, a 12-year-old boy, a neighbor she'd known since she was in diapers, caught up with her at the exit. His bright eyes looked at her with concern. "Miss Louise, are you all right?" he asked quietly. Louise smiled weakly. "It's all right, little one. Go home, okay?" She didn't want Billy to see her tears, but even his genuine concern couldn't dull the resentment that choked her from the inside. She knew it was going to be a long day, but she didn't yet suspect the worst was yet to come. After the incident at the supermarket, Chesterville fell back into its usual silence. People went about their business as if nothing had happened, but there was a tension in the air that could not be ignored. It was like an invisible wall that divided the city into two camps, those who were silent and those who were afraid to break the silent order. When Mrs. Louise left the store, she noticed how everyone around her pretended not to hear anything. Even those who usually greeted her avoided her gaze. She walked past a group of white women discussing their purchases and felt their eyes sliding over her, but no one dared to say hello. "Oh, Mrs. Louise, this must be hard for you," one of the women said, but there was no sympathy or concern in her voice. It sounded more like a formal remark. The woman slid her eyes over Louise, then went back to talking to her friends. Everyone was silent, as if in judgment, but no one dared admit what was causing the silence. Mrs. Louise felt suffocated by the air, heavy with indifference. Walter was only a link in the chain of daily humiliation, but his harsh words echoed in her mind, keeping her from pulling herself together. She thought of her husband, Henry, who had once been a supportive presence, but was now only in her memories. But it wasn't just white people who were silent. The city's black residents, also accustomed to suppression, stood by. Many of them had been raised to believe that any show of resistance could cost them a job or worse. Local African Americans were used to ducking conflict, not raising their voices, not getting into arguments, and even if someone felt hurt, they probably didn't know what to do with that hurt. When Louise reached her house, she was greeted by her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived next door. She saw Louise silently carrying the bags, clenching her teeth. "Are you all right, Louise?" she asked with concern in her voice. But there was no reproach in her question, just an empty formality like the others. Louise turned to her, looked into her eyes, but could not find in them what she expected. Mrs. Johnson, like everyone else, was part of the system, part of this acquiescence. She knew how important it was to go unnoticed, how dangerous it was to be the one who stood against the system. The system was old, entrenched, and it did not forgive those who disturbed its peace. "It's okay," Louise replied, lifting the bag higher and not giving herself a chance to be weak, but her voice sounded foreign. Silently she walked toward her house, trying to forget Walter's words and hide the pain behind calm. That night she could not sleep. Everything in Chesterville seemed to be in its place, the fatigue, the daily cares, but this silence was the hardest of all. Every step, every glance, every encounter on the street was the same confirmation that no one here would dare to resist. It was a silence that defended injustice, not sincerity. Mrs. Louise thought about how often she was silent when others were suffering. She remembered how her mother and father had taught her not to fight because it could turn into something even worse. But now that she was already 72, She could feel something inside her breaking. She sat her day in her modest living room, curled up in a chair with her knitting, but her thoughts drifted far away. The fear of change, the fear of being the first to raise their voices, was familiar to everyone in this town, and that fear held Chesterville in the clutches of silence. That was the way life in this town was arranged. No one spoke, no one objected. Each day was like the last, and Louise, even though she realized that her silence would never bring freedom, she still believed that change was possible, but only when people stopped being silent. What she didn't know, however, was that this day was near. That night Louise couldn't sleep for a long time. She lay in her old bed, under the heavy quilt she had knitted herself, and stared at the ceiling. The room was cold, though there in the house was always hot, except for the evening chill that came through the cracks in the old walls. At times like this, she felt lost, as if her whole existence were just shadows of years gone by, fading into the darkness. She could no longer turn a blind eye to what was happening in her life. That day at the supermarket, resentment had penetrated her heart like a knife. But the most painful thing wasn't that Walter Jenkins had humiliated her. The worst part was that everyone was silent. No one rose to her defense. No one tried to stop him. People just watched, stood around and pretended nothing was happening. She felt like a frayed piece that had no place in this world. Mrs. Louise had always been strong, but now it was as if her strength had deserted her. She could not find the least desire to fight. Now and then a desperate cry rose up in her soul, which could not come out. She sat her day alone in her chair, in a room dark, cold, and empty, and could find no comfort. The tears she had long held back began to fall down her arms as she touched the old fabric on her knitting project. There was nothing joyful about doing simple things like knitting when everything around her seemed vicious. It was like a hateful pastime that kept her from the more dreadful thoughts she was afraid to think. But then, as always, Billy came into her life. At that moment, he was small, but to Louise he was like a ray of light in a dark room. In the evening, he knocked on the door of her house, quietly as always. His mother, who worked on a neighboring farm, made him help with the chores, and Billy often dropped by to check on Louise to see how she was doing. "Miss Louise, are you all right?" he asked when she opened the door. His voice was not like an adult's, not restrained and careful, but sincere and full of concern. Louise tried to smile, but Billy saw that something was wrong. His big eyes immediately noticed her eyes clouded with tears. He looked into her house and saw her sitting in a chair, unmoving. "Why are you so sad, Miss Louise?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Louise shook her head, not knowing what to say. Billy was the only person who, despite his years, showed care. It was more than just friendliness to her. It was the last spark of warmth in a world that seemed ruthless. "It's hard for me, Billy," she said quietly, averting her eyes. "Sometimes it's so hard to find the strength to keep going when it seems like no one sees, no one hears." The boy walked over to her and sat her down next to her. He put his small hand on hers. It was something more than a gesture. It was a symbol that he was there for her. That not everyone in this world was indifferent to other people's pain. "I don't know why they're like that," he said, "why they say things like that, but I think you're not alone. I'll be there for you, Miss Louise." Those simple words, spoken with such childlike sincerity, made her heart clench. Billy couldn't understand the gravity of her situation, but there was more understanding in his eyes than in the eyes of adults who watched every day and pretended nothing was happening. "Thank you, Billy," Louise said, her voice trembling, but the tears that had seemed endless were now held back. The boy sat her beside her, and though she could not answer him with words, her soul seemed to fill with light. In her world, where it was so often dark, Billy was the one light that warmed her heart. But Louise knew her life couldn't get any easier. Her loneliness wasn't just physical, It was a loneliness born of decades of oppression, silence, and fear. Her tears could not heal this world, and her silence only served to strengthen its walls. Still, despite this, she felt that she wasn't completely alone. At least someone was there for her. But even in that moment, Louise realized that the coming morning would bring her more challenges. It was a foggy morning in Chesterville. The weather seemed to reflect Louise's state of mind. She did not know what the day held in store for her, but her heart clenched as it always did when she went outside. The whole city seemed to be still asleep. Only the early bird voices broke the silence. She walked slowly toward her yard, feeling tired in every cell. As Louise approached the house, her gaze immediately stopped on something unusual. There was a sign on the porch. It was large, black, with bright white letters. At first glance, Louise couldn't figure out what it was, but when she came closer, her heart nearly stopped with pain and rage. This is where the Northeast lives, and if you don't want your daughter to grow up to be like her, don't you dare stop here. Louise's eyes darkened. She stepped closer to make sure she wasn't mistaken, but the words engraved on the plaque stood before her like a lightning strike. It was a humiliation aimed straight at her soul, at her human dignity. Walter Jenkins, that filthy, contemptible man, had decided that his world was too clean for her, and he wasn't going to leave her alone. Mrs. Louise frowned in place. The gesture was not merely an insult, it was a challenge, a direct humiliation, a public shaming that followed not only for her, but for everyone who knew her, everyone who had anything to do with her. Louise felt an anger bubbling up in her chest that had been held back for far too long. However, she knew it was no accident. Walter wanted her to feel weak, to make her own neighbors look at her differently. He wanted people to think about her place, her status in this town every time they passed her house. He tried to break her, to make her voice even quieter. He knew her life was already full of pain, and now he had added another humiliation to it. Standing in front of that plaque, Louise couldn't hold back her tears. She wasn't crying from pain. No, she was crying with rage, with hopelessness. She cried because she realized that she would never be safe in this town, never be respected, but deep down she also knew she wouldn't stay with it. She took a step back, and at that moment she saw Billy emerge from the neighbor's house. The boy was coming toward her again, his head bowed, as if anticipating something. "Miss Louise, what's wrong?" he asked, coming closer and looking at the sign. Louise gritted her teeth and looked up at him. There was fear and incomprehension in his eyes, but there was still concern in his voice. This was another unbearable part of her life. She didn't want to show him her pain, but in his presence, she felt all her strength drain away. "Walter did it," she said quietly, not trying to hide her resentment. "He thought I needed to know I was out of place." Billy was silent. He looked at the sign, then back at it, trying to figure out what was going on. "I can't leave it like this," he said, his voice full of determination. "We can clean it up. I'll help you, Miss Louise." She looked at the boy. His eyes were full of determination, but Louise, feeling helpless, shook her head. "It's not gonna help, Billy. That sign can be taken down, but Walter will still find a way to humiliate me. He knows how to hurt me, and he likes to do it." Billy sighed, but didn't leave. He stood beside her, silent, as if he wanted to be beside her, in her struggle with this world that seemed to leave her no room for pride. People who passed by saw the sign, but none of them stopped to say anything. Only a few of the women they knew looked around hurriedly, trying not to notice Louise. Those who did meet her gaze quickly looked away. Everyone, like the day at the supermarket, preferred to remain silent. But the silence was complicit, and the more time passed, the more obvious it became that this silence was the support for everything that was happening around Louise. There was a growing heaviness in her soul from which there was no deliverance. Walter Jenkins, despite his status in the town, seemed to be the one who could control it all, only because others were silent. Louise stood in front of the plaque, thinking about her place in this world, about how she was still holding on to the mere memory of her dignity. But each new gesture, each new act of violence only confirmed that this world did not want her. The sunlight shone through the gray haze, creating an illusion of warmth that only added to the contrast with Louise's darkened senses. Standing next to the humiliating plaque, she felt her world crumbling. It seemed that every step she took, every glance she made, was a step in the direction of losing forever the respect for herself, the respect she had so carefully kept in her heart and in the eyes of others. Yet, despite the gravity of the moment, Billy stood beside her, without any fear. His small figure seemed even more fragile against this gigantic challenge. The boy looked determined and serious, as if in that moment there was no room in his childish eyes for fear of the overbearing forces that threatened Louise. He was the one person who didn't shy away from the pain, didn't turn away. "We have to take it down," Billy said, looking at the sign. His voice was quiet but firm. There was a determination in his simple words that was surprisingly mature for his age. Louise looked at him, holding back her tears, her heart clenched at the thought that she might lose this one moment of simple human compassion. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel that there was an insane bravery hidden in his actions. The boy, not understanding all the nuances of the danger, saw the plaque as a challenge, as something that needed to be fixed immediately. There was something in his eyes that Louise had long since lost faith in the possibility of change. "It won't help, Billy," she said, trying to speak as calmly as she could. "He's going to do everything he can to humiliate me, whether we take the sign down or not." Billy was silent for a few seconds, then looked at her as if he might know more, but there was no doubt in his eyes. "We can take at least one step to show that we're not afraid," he said, raising his eyes to the plaque. "It's not easy, but if we don't do anything, it's only going to get worse. I don't want you to feel helpless." Her gaze softened, but she still felt an inner resistance. Deep down, she knew that Billy was right. He was, despite his age, someone who saw the world as it should be, just and kind. There was no cynicism in him, no fear of what others might say or do. He was the living embodiment of an innocence that was ready to defy evil. Louise sighed heavily, and with an effort rose to her feet. "Okay, Billy, you're right, let's do it." She walked over to the plaque and, not noticing the pain in her hands, began loosening the screws that held it in place. Billy helped without backing away. He was there for her, and his presence gave Louise confidence despite her doubts and fear. She could feel her heart beating faster. This wasn't just a removal of a plaque. It was a declaration that she would not give up. Let the world around her remain as it is. Let others remain silent. Let them be afraid, but she would at least take this step. When the plaque finally fell off the wooden board, Louise was relieved. Little Billy, despite his physical weakness, was stronger than many of the adults in this town. He brought with him something simple and pure: hope. For a moment they stood there, both looking at the empty spot where the sign had just been, as a symbol that even the most evil, even the most cruel actions could be defeated. "We did it," Billy said, and his voice sounded victorious, as if they had just won the war. He held the plaque in his hands like a trophy, and seemed so proud of it that Louise felt proud of him herself. But other thoughts were swirling in her head. What would happen next? Walter wouldn't rest. He wouldn't leave her alone. He's already proven he's capable of anything, and no matter what she did, she would still be in his eyes someone who had no right to be there. "We should be ready," she said finally, taking the sign from Billy and walking up the steps into the house. "But I'm grateful to you, Billy. You've shown me that there are things worth fighting for." The boy looked at her, not understanding the gravity of her words, but nodded anyway. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he would be there for her, no matter what happened. And when Louise entered the house, she couldn't help but feel something new awaken in her. This small victory, this simple act of resistance, was something more to her than taking down the sign. It was a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. The city this day was not as it always was. Its usual silence, interrupted only by the sounds of cars running and the occasional footsteps of passers-by, was suddenly broken. The daily routine, like water absorbing everything in its current, paused for a moment as the citizens of Chesterville began to discuss the plaque which Walter Jenkins had erected in front of Mrs. Louise's house. It was not just an event. It was something that could not help but be talked about. At first, the conversations were quiet, cautious, as if one feared that the very mention of what had happened would lead to unpleasant consequences. But as time went on, the conversations grew louder, confident and full of accusations. People began to realize that this wasn't just Louise's personal grudge. It was more than that. It was a clear injustice that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Earlier in the day, women from local families stood in the marketplace. Some whispered, some shouted phrases that Louise deserved respect, not such humiliation. Walter's behavior was widely discussed. He had always been the one who was not judged, who had always seemed to be the right and decent man in the eyes of most. But now that his gesture had become public, everything had changed. "Did you see what he did?" A local teacher asked, her voice ringing with tension. "I never thought he could go to such lengths." And no one stopped him. Everyone was silent. The other women stood in a circle, talking quietly, trying to understand why everyone was silent. Why didn't anyone intervene at that moment? Why didn't they do anything to stop this humiliation? "Yeah, I'm shocked, too," Patty said, her face contorted with anger. "We all saw what Walter was doing to Louise, but we kept quiet. We all knew he was wrong, but we were afraid to say anything, afraid of being judged." The voices grew louder and louder. These conversations were no longer just a discussion of Walter's behavior. It was a real crisis of conscience. People who had been silent before began to question how long they had turned a blind eye to what was happening in their town. How long had they allowed this racism to continue, simply because they didn't want to confront it? "We're all to blame," said Peter, an old farmer who often went to the store and avoided unnecessary talk. His eyes filled with regret, and he wrapped his arms around his head. "We let Walter do as he pleased, and now we have to take responsibility for it. Louise isn't just a victim. We all made her a victim. We all let it happen." These words caused a wave of silence in the group, and in that moment, everyone began to realize how much they had become part of the system of oppression without even realizing it. They were silent, and Walter continued to stir up hatred, knowing that no one would stand up to him. These days, these moments of silence seemed so long, so eternal. The city, which had always been perceived as a close-knit community, now found itself divided. Those who had previously preferred to hide from real problems began to openly discuss what was happening. More and more people realized that silence is not just passive behavior. It is complicity in violence, in brutality, in racial injustice. But along with this realization came a growing irritation. People who had previously lived in peace with this silence now felt their consciences gnawing at them. They knew that Louise was not the only one who had suffered. Chesterville was a town where everyone knew their role, but not everyone realized that their silence had allowed this injustice to flourish. People's speeches became increasingly furious as they discussed Walter's behavior. Soon rumors of the plaque spread outside the city. Some tried to exonerate Walter, saying that he was just being overly forthright in his beliefs, that his gesture wasn't so terrible. But even among his supporters, doubts began to arise. Some began to wonder if he had crossed the line. Walter, who felt that his power and his position in the city were beginning to unravel, tried to justify his actions by claiming that his act was a warning. However, his justifications did not resonate with the hearts of the majority. On the contrary, the talk became more and more strident, and discontent grew. "We can't let this kind of thing go on," said Jonathan, one of the older residents of the town, when he heard about the conversations in the market. "This is not just disagreeing with someone's views, this is racism. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't change this town, we're all to blame for what's happened." And so, amidst these conversations, the atmosphere in the city began to change. The first sparks of protest arose, albeit timidly. People began to wonder what they would have to do next to end this oppression. Louise, though unaware of these conversations, had already become a symbol. Her resilience and her silent resistance inspired those who might become her next allies. But at the same time, the city was tense. The resentment of the people was so great that any wrong word, any wrong movement could become a spark that would ignite a real fire. Chesterville's church has always been more than just a place to pray. It was the heart of the town, its spiritual center, where people came not only to receive comfort and peace, but also to discuss important issues, to deal with problems that could affect everyone. And on this day, as rumors of Walter Jenkins' plot continued to spread and internal tensions in the town grew, the church became the place where the town's future path was to be decided. At first it was as quiet as ever. The local parishioners were, as usual, carrying on their conversations among themselves, exchanging news, some sitting silently, in deep thought, yet one could sense a slight trepidation in the air. Today's meeting was special. The Bible on the altar was a reminder that faith must be a pillar of support in these difficult times. Pastor Thomas Jackson, a man with years of experience, deep knowledge, and a discerning eye, stood before the crowd. His voice was firm, but there was also a sense of weariness in it. He knew that times were changing, and that perhaps the moment had come when silence would no longer suffice. He felt his heart ripening not only with concern for the spiritual condition of the people, but also for their moral responsibility. "Dear brothers and sisters," he began, his words echoing throughout the temple, "we are gathered here today because the moment has come when we cannot remain indifferent. We all know what has happened in our city, and while much of it is beyond human comprehension, it is important to realize that each of us is responsible for what happens in our community." The hall was quiet, and everyone in the pews seemed to sense that this was not just a sermon. It was a message that demanded action. Over the past few weeks, since the plaque incident, there had been too much talk, too much silence, too much blatant evasion of questions that cast shadows over all the people of Chesterville. And now Pastor Jackson, whose eyes have always been full of compassion, has begun to bring people out into the open. We, as a community, cannot continue to pretend that nothing is happening. We cannot remain aloof from the injustice, from the pain, from the violence that someone hides under the guise of toughness and tradition. What happened to Mrs. Louise is not just her misfortune, it is our misfortune. We are all to blame for the atmosphere in our city in which such a thing is possible. The pastor's words sounded like thunder. The people in the audience began to whisper, but none of them dared to interrupt him. The pastor continued, "Walter Jenkins was someone we respected, someone we socialized with, someone who seemed to be an important person to our city. But his behavior and his words have become a reflection of the sickness that is eating away at our city. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't step forward and recognize that each of us is responsible for the atmosphere in which we live, then we are doomed to further division." These words, while full of truth, caused confusion for many. They faced the fact that they may have been part of a problem that tacitly supported racism, injustice, and oppression. People's faces became serious, each reflecting on their actions and their place in this world. The pastor continued, his voice growing more insistent. It is important to realize that real faith is not about sitting in a warm chair and praying for your own well-being. Real faith requires action. We cannot allow our city to continue to be a place where some people suffer and others remain silent. We must be willing to step out of our comfort zone and recognize our responsibility for what is happening. Suddenly, one of the parishioners, a middle-aged man named David, stood up and said loudly, "But how can we change that? We're a small town. Walter is a man that everyone respects. If we start speaking out against him, we'll all be rejected." David's words caused confusion in the audience, and many nodded, agreeing with his skepticism. But Pastor Jackson did not let himself be led astray. "We must not be afraid," he said, meeting the gaze of everyone in the room. "I understand your fears, and they are well-founded, but if we don't act, if we don't start telling the truth, this city will never change. Our role in this community is not to be spectators, but to be participants. And if Walter thinks his gesture was just a warning, he's wrong. We will show him that racism will not be welcome in Chesterville. We will stand united as a community, as people who deserve respect." The silence lasted for a few moments. Some began to whisper, and at that moment the atmosphere in the church changed dramatically. Fear and doubt began to give way to determination. People began to realize that this was indeed the moment when they had to choose between remaining silent observers or becoming part of the change. And then old James, who was always quiet and unobtrusive, stood up in the very corner of the hall. He raised his hand and with a faint but confident voice said, "I agree. We've all been silent for too long, and if we don't change that now, what will happen to our children? We're all responsible for what's happening. I'm ready to act." At that moment, the church was filled with the echo of the realization that a new phase had arrived. People began to realize that change was possible, but that they had to work together to make it happen. Every word Pastor Jackson spoke left an imprint on their hearts, and they began to feel that this meeting was not just a discussion of a problem, but the beginning of real change. After the church meeting, which was a real catalyst for change, irreversible changes began to take place in the town. The same day Pastor Jackson gave his speech began to rock Chesterville like a boat on a rough sea. People began to feel their silence and indifference melt away under the fire of open talk. They could no longer remain bystanders, and their indifference became the source of what was beginning to spread like fire. Rumors of the meeting and its aftermath spread quickly. The day after the meeting, most of the townspeople heard that Walter Jenkins, under the pressure of public opinion and outrage, had left town. It happened so suddenly and unexpectedly that many still could not believe that a man who had been for so long a respected member of the local community had simply disappeared. Some said that Walter left because he could no longer tolerate the pressure from the residents. Others said that he left the town voluntarily, afraid that his behavior might lead to more serious consequences. The rumor was that he was going to move to a neighboring town where, in his own words, it was easier for him to live among people like him. When news of Walter's disappearance reached the majority, reactions were mixed. On the one hand, it was seen as a small victory. He seemed to be gone, leaving behind a ruined reputation. Mrs. Louise, who at that moment did not even know that he had left town, felt relieved, as if some heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. But at the same time, there was a sense of emptiness in the town. When Walter left, the larger issues that faced Chesterville were not resolved. It was hard to believe that the mere disappearance of one man would solve the problems that town had been facing for decades. People began to realize that although Walter was a symbol of oppression, his passing did not make the town free of racism and injustice. Everything was still in the same place.
Even so, many saw Walter's disappearance as the first real victory in a long struggle. For some, though, it was only a temporary relief, not a long-awaited solution. There was talk that Walter had left behind not only a reputation as a racist, but also a long history of subordinating people he tried to intimidate and control. Many of those who had once been afraid or silent now began to openly discuss his actions and try to understand how long they had been silent witnesses to his harassment. But their conversations were increasingly saying the same thing: while his leaving was an important step, it didn't solve all the problems. People began to realize that it would take more than just eliminating one person from public life to change a city. And while they tasted victory, it was a bitter taste. It did not bring with it complete joy. Walter was gone, but that didn't mean his problems disappeared with him. On dark evenings, as silence once again filled the streets of Chesterville, there seemed to be much deeper issues behind his disappearance. The act was not a miracle solution that would erase all traces of racism and social injustice, but it did signal that people were now beginning to look seriously for ways to make change. Yet there was still fear in the city, and if Walter left, it didn't mean he couldn't come back. Didn't mean his views disappeared with him. Many feared that, despite everything, he might have returned and continued to sow discord elsewhere. Word of mouth claimed that he would be much harder to find in the new place, but still, many believed that he was not the only source of the problem. In homes where yesterday there were no discussions about racism or seeing the problem, there were now conversations about how to properly fight prejudice and intolerance, how to change the very atmosphere of the city. But there was still the same fear in the streets, the same internal barrier that prevented people from acting openly. Even with Walter Jenkins gone, that barrier remained. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it is also a huge weight that is difficult to lift. Despite the sense of relief that Walter's disappearance brought, the city realized it still had a long way to go. A man was gone, but the problem, as it turned out, was much deeper. With Walter gone, Chesterville was not the town it had been before. Outwardly, everything continued as normal. People went about their business, socialized among themselves, children played in the streets. But beneath this superficial calm was a resentment and pain that was impossible to ignore. Louise, still walking around with barely visible traces of tears on her cheeks, felt her life changing. She knew she had not experienced the plague incident the way others expected her to. That moment didn't disappear. It continued to be her shadow, a reminder that the city had long been silent when she was humiliated, and that for many of her neighbors, her suffering was simply something extraneous, not requiring intervention. Although she was relieved that Walter was gone, deep in her heart there were still traces of pain and disappointment. Every step she took into her little house felt heavier, as if stones were being laid in her soul. She knew her life would never be the same, although no one called her an old black woman anymore. As Walter did, her mental wounds remained. Louise felt that this town, despite the outward changes, still left her by the wayside. The house where she had once raised her children was now nothing but emptiness. Alone, amidst the memories of the past, she tried to piece herself back together, hoping that on a day she could regain what she had lost. But that moment never came. Looking outside through the window, she noticed how things had changed in people's perception. Although her neighbors had become more attentive and avoided her gaze less often, she was still not quite herself in their eyes. Their silence and fear became obvious to her. Louisa felt that they looked at her not as a person, but as an object towards which they could afford to feel everything: pity, contempt, and fear. She was not sure that they understood her pain, and it made her feel alien again. This included her neighbor Mary, a middle-aged woman with whom Louise had once exchanged warm words over the fence. Now avoiding her gaze, Mary stood aside when issues of racism and silence were brought up at the church meeting. She was not among those who dared to speak up. She just sat quietly in the corner, pretending none of this concerned her. And now, after Walter's disappearance, she still didn't dare to talk to Louise as she had before. It was clear that her conscience was not clear. Mary felt guilty, but preferred to stay in the shadows, still hiding her thoughts behind false smiles. Louise, despite her desire to maintain her dignity, felt her heart slowly dying at these mute accusations. There was more than mere passivity behind the silence of the people. It was the same fear system that had once allowed Walter to act with impunity. The fear remained, and it firmly encircled the city. Silently and deeply, in every conversation over a cup of coffee, in every look, in every step through the streets, people continued to hide a truth that was too hard to admit. How was it possible to undo what silence and fear had sustained for so long? People tried to continue living as they had before, but the world they knew was shattered, and now, when they looked at Louise, there was no respect or love in their eyes, only silent judgment and worry. Meanwhile, outside Louise's home, on other streets in the city, her silent neighbors were also feeling the effects of what had happened. Even those who tried to convince themselves that they had nothing to do with racism began to feel the weight of their silence. Some, like Mary, turned it away, while others tried to justify themselves in conversations with neighbors who had no pushback. These conversations began to include words that had never been heard before. It's all our fault. Why didn't they intervene? These questions, though poignant, were still unanswered. How was it possible to regain what had been lost? And even if society was now loudly proclaiming its readiness for change, who was really willing to put their life on the line for something more important? Walter is gone, but he didn't leave a void. He left pain and the realization that many of those who supported him did not see the real cost of silence. And while his disappearance was seen as the end of a chapter, that end only opened a new, even more painful one. Chesterville was not free from fear and silence, and that fear continued to work within everyone associated with the town.
The scars on their hearts were not only visible on Louise, they were on everyone who remained silent when they should have spoken. And even though the town was beginning to realize its guilt, everyone remained bound by this silence, which indicated that there was no turning back. Mrs. Louise Saturday by the window, as she did every evening, in the very chair that had once been filled with the noise of life. She held in her hands a piece of yarn, a tightly twisted ball of yarn. Slowly, with each loop, she continued to knit the plaid for Billy, her young friend who never gave up on her, despite everything that was going on. It was a simple plaid, not particularly pretty or colorful or expensive, but there was something much more important in it. With each pull of the needle, she thought of Billy, of the way he had looked at her with those earnest eyes, full of concern. At the moment when her world was falling apart, he was the only one who, despite his youth, had been willing to hear her pain and put his small hand on her shoulder. The plaid wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise that despite everything, life would go on. Everything she'd been through wasn't in vain. Whether everyone around her was silent or not, it didn't mean she had to be silent. This was her answer to everything that had happened in Chesterville, her small victory that she was willing to share. Her movements were slow but sure. She hardly noticed how imperceptibly this knitting had become her way of coping with what she had experienced. In each strand of yarn was a piece of her strength, her courage, and her willingness to go on despite the hardships this city had brought her. Remembering Billy, she thought of how that boy, despite his childhood, in which there should have been room for joy, had found the courage to help her. He was that spark in the dark room of her soul. That first little act of resistance against all those years of silence and fear. When she finished the last row, she clutched the plaid in her hands and held it to her chest. It was so warm and soft, as if it gave her strength. She felt the weight that had been on her shoulders all this time lessen a little. She got up and made her way to Billy's room to give him the sign that life hadn't stopped after all. To her, to herself, it wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of new hope. On the way to Billy's house, Louise felt a strange but firm sense of reassurance. She couldn't explain exactly how it had all happened, but her little loneliness, her inner wounds, didn't seem so deep now. Even if the world around her wasn't perfect, even if people weren't willing to change their nature, she could still leave a mark for herself and for Billy. When she arrived at his house, Billy looked reserved and quiet as always, but when he saw her, his face lit up, his eyes gleamed with genuine interest and gratitude. He went up to her and she held out the plaid to him, his warm heart and his childish palms immediately touching its soft fabric. "It's for you, Billy," Louise said, unable to hold back a slight smile. "I hope you like it." He gently took the plaid, and his face, despite all they had been through, brightened. "I knew you'd be okay, Mrs. Louise. You're always strong. I'm glad you didn't give up." Her eyes filled with tears. He was right. She hadn't given up, and that plaid, like a small thread, connected her to what she had once lost, and to what she kept looking for. In that moment, in their little conversation, she felt that in a world full of pain and injustice, there was room for goodness, for honesty, and for real human contact. Billy, this young boy, was living proof that all it takes to make a difference is a small act of kindness. She stood in that house, and her heart, though full of scars, was filled with peace. She knew that neither silence, nor pain, nor humiliation could take away her ability to love, feel, and believe. And when she left Billy's house, there was no more pain on her face, only a slight but confident smile. This town, which once could have easily broken her, now saw in her a strength it never expected. And no matter how hard life was to go on, Mrs. Louise knew that every day was a new chance, a new step forward. And every day, despite everything that was going on around her, she continued to knit, knitting for Billy, for herself, and for all those who were looking for light in the darkness. She believed that, like her plaid, small acts of kindness could keep her warm and make this world a little better. And maybe for Chesterville, that faith was the beginning of something new. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.